send you the...
What? Aurora and I took a trip to North Carolina after having a conversation with Robert by Zoom. The genealogy of Jeffco, take one.
And the name Pippin, according to one site, goes all the way back to Charlemagne's son, Pippin of Italy.
Today we are here, but tomorrow may see just a grave in the vale and a memory of me.
Now said that everyone's related to royalty if you're from Europe, but the Pippin line continues from that original Pippin of Italy.
Between the Hinrichs family and Charlemagne, there are roughly 40 generations. This is the Pippin.
She's the one who owns slaves. Sarah Elizabeth, this is your mom's grandmother. This is your mom's great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. Mary's great-grandfather.
Yeah. So Pippin is on Mary's mother's side, the Sadler-Pippin side. And the Pippin line starts with John Pippin, who was born in England and was part of a family that gets kicked out of their church and so is ostracized and I guess becomes very poor. He gets caught at the age of 16 stealing, and the punishment at that time was either you got branded on your hand indicating that you are a thief, or you would be put on a ship to America and you would serve 7 years as an indentured servant. And so that was his punishment. He was put on a ship and was supposed to be dropped off in Virginia, but for some reason they drop him off in Maryland. And he becomes an indentured servant to a guy whose last name is Moore. After 7 years, he marries Moore's daughter, Rebecca, where they think she's related to Moore in some way. They have even been a servant. And he starts to become a planter of tobacco. So that's where the first tobacco connection is. And then after he dies, some of his sons go to Edgecombe, North Carolina, where they are founding members of the Edgecombe County. And originally that county was inhabited by the Tuscaroras, and they are hunters. They have hunting grounds. And so the original settlers from Virginia were the second sons in the family who were not entitled to inherit their father's land. It all went to the first son. So they went to Edgecombe County to hunt, and they lived in harmony with the indigenous people at the Tuscaroras because they didn't bother their hunting grounds and they hunted elsewhere. So there was no threat. It was only when people wanted to start cultivating the land that the wars between the natives and the settlers began. So John Pippin's sons moved to Edgecombe. They become founding members of the community there. And then the Revolutionary War breaks out, and Ensign John Pippin becomes a war hero. He serves in the Navy. And then Jeff and I went and visited the grave site, and there's actually a bunch of graves there from the Pippin family, and a farmhouse, quite beautiful. The cemetery is on the farmhouse grounds. And John Pippin then has sons who end up becoming very wealthy, planting and harvesting tobacco. And of course, in order to harvest tobacco, you have to take on slaves. During the Civil War, two of the sons, Flavius and Cullen, die, and William Mayo Pippin becomes a bigwig in the legislature, and he fights against Reconstruction. He argues that the black vote should be diluted, and so that gets adopted where they establish 3 wards with majority white vote. Then his sister is Mamie George Pippin, who was Mary's grandma Sadler. She marries a Sadler, Ryland O.T. Sadler, and they move to Maryland. And he's a dentist, so there's that dentist connection. And then Mary's mother, Elizabeth O.T. Pippin Sadler, becomes a daughter of the American Revolution, and she does all digging around history. And somewhere there are these notebooks. We should find them. And she is now a registered member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, on Mary's other side, the Hinrichs, they are related to George Wilhelm Gale, who comes here from Germany. His father accompanies him. He's studied English and he's studied business and commerce. And he gets here and he ingratiates himself to the German communities, and they say that the tobacco here is tasteless, that the tobacco back in Germany is much better. So he gets the idea of setting up a factory that manufactures cigarettes and tobacco chew. And his first thing is he imports German cigars, and that gives him a good chunk of money to invest in this factory. And he becomes quite wealthy. Within 20 years, he makes $240,000, which in today's money would be about $5 million. So he becomes wealthy pretty fast. So both sides of the family make a lot of money on tobacco. He becomes very involved in the politics of his time. He's head of the German History Society, or German whatever. And his company is called Gale and Axe. And there are actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art a bunch of little, I guess were advertisements, but there were these little boxes with artwork on it, and now the Metropolitan Museum of Art has that collection. There's just one other interesting story, and I don't know if this is a Pippin that is related to your Pippin line, but is a Pippin. He is a man in Baltimore or Maryland who is accused of killing a shop owner and then gets acquitted, and the mob is so angry that he was acquitted, they go to his house, they find him hiding underneath the floorboards, and they drag him out and they hang him. So it's sort of like a lynching. And then the other interesting fact I found was that one of John Pippin's sons, Robert, his son Robert, he doesn't move to Edgecombe. He is listed in the literature as being mad, being a madman and being easily distracted. But he ends up living with his son Benjamin, and he eventually, I guess, marries and becomes stable. But early on in his life, there's all these court documents where they're petitioning to have him cared for by his brother and to be paid to be cared for by his brother because of his affliction, which they describe as him as a madman who's easily distracted. Thought that was interesting. Oh yes, so William Mayo Pippin is the Pippin who builds this incredible Italianate mansion on Main Street of Tarboro. Jeff and I visited it. It's this grand house with the biggest lawn of that time. He's one of the first to put in a lawn, which wasn't done back then. And he had two daughters, or actually three daughters, two of which die in infancy, and one, Hester Moore Pippin, who drowns with her friend in a pond. And apparently the friend gets to safety, but turns back to rescue Hester and drowns with Hester as well. Apparently there was some undercurrent that was very strong. And the town was very shaken by this, and they were buried together, and there's a big monument to them. It's a real American story. And then when I think about Mary becoming a Quaker and all of that.
Great. Thank you, honey.
All right, so now or German whatever, little the mob, he mad, anything else, anything else that you can remember? Mad. Yeah. His name was John Solomon Pippin. insane.
Great. Thank you, honey.
That's better. It's a little more streamlined too.